All right, we are live. Great. So wait for a few more to join and then we'll get started, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Salam, Sister Summer. All right, salam everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Inshallah, we're going to get started soon. I first just want to say thank you so much to Brother Antonio from AMG Council and Brother Oways, who is the president of Saturna, who is going to be presenting to us today on a very important topic, navigating special needs trust for individuals with disabilities. Here at Mohsin, we have a lot of families asking about this. So today, as a resource, we are hosting this session. And from here, I will let Brother Oways continue, inshallah.
All right. Thank you for that, Yasmin. Assalamu alaikum. Rabbi shrah li sidri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. It's great to be here. We started on this endeavor a couple of months ago with Mohsin because they saw the need for this as we do every day, myself and Antonio, who's the attorney who will be making the presentation today. So this is an educational session on living trust, wills, and special needs trust. And you may have seen on the flyer that it talks about AMG Council and also Saturna Capital. So Saturna Capital, you may know it more as Amana Mutual Funds, because that's what we do. 99% of our day is about Amana Mutual Funds. But this is not about Amana Mutual Funds today. But the reason I'm involved is because I'm the president of Saturna Trust Company. And recently, the most recent time that Antonio and I have worked together was on a couple of children's protection trust. And so what we're going to find today is that you can create your trust of various kinds, but you may want to have someone manage it. It takes out certain emotions and whatnot and lets a professional do that. So Antonio will talk a little bit about that. What we've learned, though, around the country when I'm making presentations, the most recent one was at Islamic Society of North America. I think it was the 60th annual convention, and before that Muna, and before that ICNA, and at various masajid and so forth, is that when we bring up the subject of trust and wills, and I ask people to raise their hand how many have actually gotten this started. Out of a crowd of 150 last time, I think there was 10 people that raised their hand. And as we know, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that if anyone has something of value to will or to give upon their death, they can't travel for more than 2 days without having this established. And so it's really important, especially in America, where a trust is really going to protect much of what you need, especially if you have children. This is why you're here today. Is if you have children, it makes it even more necessary to have a trust and maybe even a special needs trust. So I'm going to introduce Antonio, who's going to go through this amazing presentation, which I've seen. And Antonio practices law in Maryland and in Texas currently. He can fill us in on some of his other achievements if you would like before he gets started, particularly his work, being enlisted to be able to practice law at the Supreme Court as well. I think that's interesting. If you just want to point that out before you get started, Antonio. And we thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a lot of questions. Start putting those in the comments section, and we'll start taking those at some point during the presentation today.
Great. Thank you, Brother Oways. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Mohsin, for having me speak. Again, I'm Antonio Glenn. I'm an attorney. I practice in Maryland, D.C., and Texas. I've been practicing estate planning and law for almost 15 years. My connection to special needs trust and somewhat estate planning is that my parent or our mom passed away maybe about 10 years ago. And I have two siblings with special needs. And so not only when you're trying to manage the estate planning for your siblings and family, when it's special needs, it's a lot more difficult, and there's so much more information you have to go through. So that's how I'm connected to this. I like to be there for the families to help them kind of go and navigate through these touchy topics and subjects. Again, I'm also barred in the Supreme Court of the United States. I got that ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It allows me to go to the Supreme Court and hear all of the cases that come forward. And there are a couple special needs cases that I think will be on the docket, hopefully sometime this year or next year. But enough about me. Let's get started with you all, and we'll start to go through navigating the special needs trust for individuals. Okay. Let me make sure the slides. Okay. So a special needs trust really should be known as a supplemental needs trust. And it's the arrangement that is made up and is designed to help secure and partition assets or separate assets for a person who has disabilities. I think we'll go into this discussion a little bit. Most individuals who have disabilities, whether they were born with a disability, maybe they were inflicted with a disability by some unfortunate accident, but they now more than likely either get some type of supplemental funds like SSI, they're getting Medicaid or some other form of federal government benefits. And so this supplemental needs trust is what you kind of should think about it, but it's easier to be called special needs trust, is an entity set up to help keep those benefits intact. You can see here, there are different ways to set up a special needs trust. The first one is the main one, which is just a supplemental needs, which allows for the disabled person to have funds available to them that are not coming from the government, and it's not replacing governmental funds. That's what we don't want to do. You have a third party special needs trust. And the third party is, in my situation, I had two siblings, a brother and a sister. And say, for instance, I wanted to give money to them. If I were to give them money outright, this could jeopardize their governmental benefits. For those of you on the call who don't know, you can only have about $2,000 in assets if you're a person with a disability. And with that $2,000, if you go above that, the government may lower your governmental benefits, or it may, take them away, and you don't want to jeopardize those. And so having this third party special needs trust available allows someone like myself, a parent, a grandparent, to gift or give to a person with a disability without jeopardizing those funds. You also have what's called a self-settled special needs trust. This is a trust set up by the individual who has the disability. Again, they have this $2,000 spend down or $2,000 kind of limit or cap that they can have. But let's say they do some work as well. Maybe they're not fully disabled, but they're able to get SSI benefits, and maybe they work. So they start working and accumulating funds. They can deposit that money into this self-settled special needs trust, put that money to the side for themselves, and save it later. And we'll get back into a little bit more details on how that works on payback and Medicaid once that person passes away. The other trust is called a pooled special needs trust. And what this says and does is it pools all the funds together of individuals with disabilities. And there's a nonprofit organization that manages those funds. They make sure that the money is invested properly. It goes into ways in order to make earnings and income. And then that beneficiary is able to take a disbursement or use those funds that's available to them to go maybe on vacation or do maybe education or do some other supplemental needs for themselves. And that's the pool trust is set up for that. There's some payback provisions along with that, but we'll get into that a little later on. And please, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll try to get to those while they're fresh in your mind. Okay, so who needs a special needs trust? Basically, it's really simple. An individual who's disabled and getting governmental benefits, maybe a family member. I've had clients come to me and say they want a special needs trust, but actually I wouldn't steer them in that direction because they don't have any individuals who are getting governmental benefits and they don't plan on applying for any governmental benefits. Maybe the individual is somewhat on the spectrum and they do want to have some control and provisions in place for them. So having a good trustee in place is actually more beneficial for them than maybe a special needs trust. But a special needs trust is really for those who are disabled and you want to keep those governmental benefits intact, and having a good trustee manage and provide for those is key for that. So let's put this in perspective. Again, the special needs trust is going to recharacterize the assets. So you have assets that are accountable to get paid back to the government entity that's providing you funding. So if an individual with a disability is getting SSI, which is Social Security Supplemental Income, maybe they're getting SSDI, which is Social Security Disabled Insurance, maybe they're getting Medicaid or some other governmental benefit. If they're earning money or generating income, that'll be counted towards that $2,000 cap or threshold that they can keep money. And then they'll have to either pay that back or they may lose some of those benefits. Having this special needs trust allows you to park some of those funds and money and have them as non-countable or not be counted towards that, and allow for the disabled person to still benefit from the money they're generating. So think of it as, okay, I get SSI, that's about $815 a month. I'm living at home with mom and dad, they're taking care of me, and most of my expenses, that money's gonna start to grow because you're not really using it as much. Maybe in 3-4 months, most individuals start to have to spend down those funds. Okay, we have to spend this money so we keep the benefits going, or else they'll cut them off or they'll start to lower how much we're getting paid. So the special needs trust is set up in order to take some of those excess funds, put it into the trust, and that way, when the person with the disability needs something, maybe respite care, maybe they want to send their kids off to a camp for 2-3 weeks to give themselves a break while they go to summer camp. Maybe there's some educational programs that they want that person or child to go to. You can use these funds for this and to better the quality of life and help supplement, again, what the individual is getting from governmental benefits. Maybe they're in a residential group home and you like the way they're living. The public benefits that program that's set up for them is doing enough, but you can add more to that with the excess funds. And that's what the special needs trust allows you to do, is kind of partition or hoard off some of that money and use it for establishing a better lifestyle for that individual. Again, the most important thing about supplemental needs trust is what is properly called, and its purpose is not to supplant. So if you look at the chart, you can see that food, shelter, medical items are paid by Medicaid. In certain states, Medicaid will often pay for residential group homes. So let's say the parents added them to a list in that state. That individual gets to a certain age, normally 21 in most states, and they're allowed to go live on their own with other individuals with special needs. Their food is somewhat paid for, and the money that's allotted for them is paying for their shelter and some of their medical expenses. The supplement that you have in place to cover these would be some social needs or recreational needs. So let's say they all wanted to go on a trip together. You're able to use some of those funds that you put in a special needs trust or a third-party trust and use those to enhance that person's life. So for my siblings, I always wanted them to go to summer camp. There would be special needs trusts available for them. Each state normally has maybe like an ARC or some other entity that does camps for individuals with special needs. Maybe there's some educational programs. There are a lot of like Zumba My sister, she used to love to dance, so I would take her to and put her in Zumba classes. And she really enjoyed that. And that got her out and personable. Because one thing about people with special needs, you want to get them out in the community and you want to continue to have them have a real full lifestyle. And so having funding and funds available for this, maybe a proper wheelchair or some other medical needs, allows them some flexibility and growth in this. And you get to keep those funds. You don't have to keep spending them down and keep worrying about losing the funding that's available for you. So when we start to plan with the Special Needs Trust, a few of the things that we'll start out with, of course, is identifying what public benefit program you're under. I think this is really key because if you don't have any public benefit program, maybe you might want to look into that. That's an option for you, whether through your state or federal. You're probably more than likely to be able to get Medicaid, again, SSI, which is supplemental income, or SSDI if that person has become disabled, especially if they become disabled before 26. Now, unfortunately, some individuals become disabled because they were maybe in a horrific accident. Something happened. It was a really bad car accident or something, and they become disabled later in life. And so those are programs that are set up that may not always be means tested, but most of the time they're going to get a lump sum settlement or some type of lawsuit that they've won, and will definitely want to set aside funding for that because they're going to want to start public benefits and get on SSI or disability because they may no longer be able to work and be self-sufficient moving forward. But that lawsuit money, you would hate to have to spend down $500,000 to an individual so they can apply for public benefit programs when you know they're going to need that money later on. We'll understand the characteristics of that program. We can get into this a little bit, but some programs are means tested, some are for veterans, and some are non-means tested. But for our purposes, we'll be talking about a mean tested program, which means we have to be careful on how much resources are available for the individual. Again, we talked a little bit about, is the trust necessary? Again, if the person isn't getting that public assistance, it may not be necessary. You may not want to go through that process. Maybe you want to set up a good revocable living trust for yourself that allows for someone like Saturna Capital to be the trustee to manage the funds for that individual, even though it's not in a quote unquote special needs trust, but you have an administrator there to manage the assets that you worked hard for in order to make sure that that child is maintained and taken care of. And yes, different goals for different programs are from there. And really quickly, here's just a quick 5 list of what we talked about: supplemental security income, the Social Security, disability, Medicare, Medicaid, and veterans. And again, some folks will only be eligible for certain programs. And if you have questions about those, you can feel free to reach out to me. So to be eligible for the most part for benefits and somewhat setting up a special needs trust, you need to be disabled, of course. Mostly every state has its own disability requirement, what they determine to be disabled. Many individuals are probably intellectual or have developmental disabilities that doesn't allow them to continue to work or generate an income for themselves, and they'll get on SSDI. Some have been, again, in a car accident. Maybe something happened in their life, in an accident. And then after that time, they were now disabled. Maybe they're in a wheelchair or something, some type of other damage to them, and they're not able to take care of themselves. And then there's some age restrictions. You can still have elderly people who can become disabled, and you want to set up some special needs trust for them. Most of the time, we declare that as Medicaid planning because they'll be using Medicaid in their advanced age to qualify for their governmental benefits and housing and arrangements. And you still don't want to lose those because the criteria is very similar to one another on that $2,000 spend down. Now that the person is older, so some of us, like myself, when I started to think about my parents and my friends and their parents, they have to be careful about this as well. And maybe a good trust or special needs trust may be needed for those who are elderly and start to become disabled and need some help. And they want to make sure they're not spending down all of their funds. The other thing is what we talked about is means tested benefit eligibility. Again, what this means is that this special needs trust is really needed because if the individual starts to either get an inheritance, maybe aunt and uncle, dad, brother and sister pass away, and they give to that person with an individual because they're kind, they're thinking, oh, I want to take care of, so and so because they need the help and they're still alive and they'll need the needs. They'll want to gift that money to them directly. And we don't want that. So we want is a third party special needs trust to be set up to take that money for that individual so they can keep their benefits and meet this means tested benefits of eligibility. And for those who have questions about this, it can get a little more technical in detail. Please put a question in the chat, or you can have my email at the end and I can respond to that a little bit more. Okay, so we talked a little bit again about the benefits of the special needs trust and what it would offer those individuals and kind of go through there. Protecting the aid is the primary reason to set it up and to have that to be in place. The other thing too is to protect the beneficiary. We want to make sure that we have a good trustee available to help manage the assets that are put into that trust. Some people have asked, hey, do I need to do a trust? It could be, time consuming, it could be complicated. Can I do a will? A will is not going to allow you to kind of dictate things from the beyond. It's not going to allow you to name a trustee to manage and set in some controls for that individual once you pass away. The will is going to go, it's going to get probated. It's going to be a public document. So everyone's going to see it when it goes to probate. Probate can be expensive and timely process. And it's not going to protect the governmental funds. So if in a will you say, hey, I have my house, I have my house is worth 500,000, I have a car and I have this, and I'm going to leave it to my son. Guess what? When you pass away and go to probate, you have now gifted your son your house, 500,000, car, 30,000, retirement, another 50,000. Now he has about $550,000 in assets. And guess what? If he wants to keep his governmental funding, let's say he's in a residential group home or he's in SSI or some other program, he's going to lose that program or that funding until he spends down this $550,000. Or worse, if something happens, he has to pay back Medicaid because there is a payback period with Medicaid. And that's the other good reason to have the special needs trust or a third party special needs trust is to kind of control that payback provision. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But protecting the benefits, protecting the assets that are gifted to the person with an individual, and then having a trustee manage those assets are really keys to helping with the special needs trust. And you don't get that with a will. That's just not provided for you. Setting up the special needs trust immediately too allows for you to separate it from the individual's income and have its own EIN number, but we can talk about some of those details later. The special needs trust, again, assets in the trust are managed prudently by the trustee. The trustee is responsible for investing those funds and money, protecting those. A trustee also has a fiduciary duty, which means they have a legal responsibility to that person who has a disability. You'll see in some residential group homes, they'll ask for a power of attorney form, or they'll ask for medical directives. And as the individual, if you're still living, maybe you're older and you can't take care of your disabled one any longer, you don't want to give up all of that power and authority to an agency. You want to either have someone someone like Sir Turner, who you feel, hey, I'm comfortable. I know them. I have assets with them. I have investments with them. They know how to invest this money so it can last a long time, you know, for your child, and they're able to use it moving forward. And so that financial security for the individual will really be there. It also helps cut off creditors, potential creditors for coming after certain assets that are pooled in that special needs trust, and allows a lot of flexibility. The trustee can also make different changes or provisions in the trust needed, maybe to save on taxes. Maybe the person with a disability, maybe they have a child, maybe they have some other beneficiaries that they're looking forward to. And also in the special needs trust, if it's a third party special needs trust, if the person with the disability passes away, those funds and assets in that third party special needs trust don't have to go back to Medicaid. There's no automatic Medicaid payback provision in that trust. A self-settled special needs trust, which is a trust that's set up or funded by the person with the disability. In those trusts, sometimes you do have to include a Medicaid payback provision, which says, hey, if I pass away and there's $10,000 remaining in this self-settled special needs trust, this will go back to pay Medicaid that had given me money for me to live off and benefits throughout my lifetime. And that's what you want to do. So if you want to preserve those assets that have been passed down, the special third-party special needs trust is a great approach to do that. And a will won't provide you those opportunities. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about funding a special needs trust. So funding a trust is the most important thing about setting up a trust, whether it's a revocable trust, irrevocable trust, whatever kind of trust that you have, funding it is key. And funding the trust means that you're going to either transfer assets to the trust. So now the trust owns the assets. So me, Antonio Glenn, I have a new car. I have a Tesla. Okay, I'm going to transfer title of my Tesla over to the Antonio Glenn Trust 101. So I go down to DMV. I transfer that car over to the trust. Now the trust owns it. I say, you know what? I don't want to be trustee. I want Brother Always to be trustee because he's going to take care of the car. He's going to make sure it's clean and managed. And now he's the trustee of the vehicle. He keeps it upkeep. Now the beneficiary might be my child. Maybe my child has special needs. Oasis says, hey, I'm going to rent the car out and generate money for your daughter who has special needs. And that's how it's done. And that's why funding the trust is very important. Because if you don't do this, then the trust pretty much somewhat fails in itself, because everything is under your name and it won't go by the provisions and directions that you had worked really hard and sought forward for your child or person with a disability. So the sources of funding the special needs trust. We talked a little bit about a family contribution. So this is when you would set up what we know as the third party special needs trust. Family contribution, grandparents, maybe there's some money that they've had and they're going to bequeath or gift to that individual for them to have. Also an inheritance. Say I pass away and in my will, I gift $5,000 to that individual. Having that special needs trust set up would allow those funds to go there safely and cleanly, and you don't have to worry about it. Maybe that person with a disability, maybe a birthday is important to you. Maybe Eid, and they get Eid, and it builds up and grows. You put those funds in to the special needs trust and do it. Another thing most people don't think about is personal injury settlements. And they see this a lot in legal cases where a person, again, they're in some really bad accident and they get a windfall judgment or settlement, maybe sometimes millions of dollars, and they can't just get that money outright because then they have to spend it down. Now, some people may choose, okay, you know what? Yeah, we'll just live off those funds. But some say, hey, they're in a residential group home. I want to keep this money and not have to pay it back to Medicaid. Let's set up a good special needs trust for them and have these funds in there so they won't be accountable toward that. And then if that person passes away, those funds can be used for other family members and be gifted to other beneficiaries. The same with life insurance. We would name the trust as the life insurance beneficiary, or maybe the special needs trust would own the life insurance. I know some of us don't believe in life insurance or maybe adhere to that policy, but if in the program or your job or employment you have life insurance, you would probably want to make sure on your beneficiary forms that you don't name the person with the disability to receive those funds outright. You would prefer those funds to go to the trust. And that's the same with a revocable living trust or irrevocable trust, of funding these properly and naming the beneficiaries properly is paramount. And of course, savings and investments in retirement are things that can fund it. So a big key piece about setting all of these up is trustee selection and choosing the right trustee. The role of the trustee, of course, manages the assets in the trust. Many times people will set up a revocable living trust, maybe a husband and a wife, and they'll be co-trustees with one another. They'll transfer the assets into the trust. They'll know what cars they want, maybe their primary residence. Maybe you have a vacation home somewhere, and this is all retitled to the trust. You all manage it for your benefit, and then you're the named beneficiaries, and your kids are your successor beneficiaries, which means they would benefit after you pass away as the parents. In a special needs trust, in the case that Owace and I were working on, we had younger minor individuals, and they could not take the funds outright. And that wasn't our goal for them. Our goal for them was to preserve the assets for them. And so instead of the family member continuing to be the trustee, we thought, hey, let's have Saturna do it. Less bias, more focused on, investing the assets for long-term growth and sustainability. Now, the young minors, once they come of age or they go to college, they come, and it's called HEMS, Health, Education, Maintenance, and Support. So Turnus understands what's in the trust and what's the directions of the trust, and that's their role. And they also have a fiduciary or a legal duty to do this. And so when you pick someone who understands what their role is, keeping good accounting, keeping good books, and making sure everything is good. So if the beneficiary or someone else comes and says, hey, how are the finances looking, they'll be able to know objectively. And this could be very different from having a professional trustee over a family member, where a family member, sometimes you name someone, yes, they love that person, they care about them a lot, but they're not as savvy with financial investments. They're not as savvy in keeping the compliance and the records and documentation and accounting of everything. And if they commingle funds, maybe they don't, remember to put money in the trust account, and they put it in the account of the person with the disability. Now you have a snafu. Now you're spending 2 days in the Social Security office trying to get benefits reinstated because of some mishap from a family member. And everyone's busy and it's tough, and dealing with people with special needs is very, very tough, especially if they are really far and have a severe disability. And you have to learn these things. So having professionals who are trained for this and understand this can help alleviate a lot of stresses and problems on that, because governmental funding is a big key piece for a lot of families to be able to maintain care for their child. Some folks have people with disabilities who need long-term care at home. So maybe it's a program, think, hey, we have a nurse that comes home or an aide that comes and sits with the individual. I know my brother and sister, especially during COVID, it was tough for them to get out. But there was a program set up where an individual, an aide would come and get them, take them out to go do some recreation. My sister, they would take her to her Zumba class, because you're working, you're busy, and you don't always have time to do this. So having these programs and things in place, and having a trustee who understands this and says, hey, you have funds available for this. Hey, you have funds available for what's called respite care or camp for that individual, is really key. And you can work hand in hand with them without being overburdened with that. Again, they understand the investment strategies for the trustee, and doing it in doing those things, the distribution rules and guidelines on how to fund it, how to get money out of the trust and to the individual and make that distribution as well. So whether it's that supplanting or supplementing, so not spending money on food and shelter, but more so supplementing those needs when you get to it. A good trustee understands the ongoing responsibility of the reporting, the record keeping, and everything. Social Security and the disability agencies normally update their records. Social Security will send a reporting notice to the individuals, and if they don't do that, they'll pause or halt funding if that trustee or individual doesn't report those earnings properly. The same for the disability agencies. Each state has its own, maybe health and human resources department. And I would say maybe every 10 years, they'll send you a packet and kind of reconfirm that the person who's getting disability benefits is still disabled. Do that. And you want to have your documentation in a row. So if you have a good trustee who understands on the financial part and you're able to work with you on keeping good records, you can have those things ready. Because when you get the call, they want it immediately, and they'll just call you out the blue and send you a letter and say, hey, we need, the psychological report. We need these financial documents right away. And you may not always have those because you're busy taking care of that disabled individual. A little bit more impartial decision making. I know with a few of my trustees and going with a professional trustee, corporate trustee over a family member is the bias on when do you give the funds. The young person comes and they want money for this, that, or the other. A family member, sometimes they'll give it maybe begrudgingly, but they still give it, or they don't take care of the funds in a proper manner, the way it was intended. Again, the management and continuity of it. Sometimes you have a family member who's just not engaged. Maybe they have their own, they have their own life, their own kids and things like this that are preoccupying them. So they're not keeping an eye on the investments and the long-term growth of it for that individual. And that's where a professional trustee can come in and really help that and avoid some of the common mistakes for the special needs trust. So avoiding these pitfalls, lack of clarity in your trust, failure to consider future needs for those individual legal assistance, going to an attorney. Hey, I have a few questions. Did I set this trust up properly? Is this a proper distribution that wouldn't jeopardize their funding? And again, having the wrong trustee who mismanages funds or has them in non-compliance. So those are some of the pitfalls that we see in trusts, especially special needs trusts, because the ramifications for failing in that part are so much stronger and harsher in certain regards. And sometimes you have to go to court or you have to backtrack and do a lot in order to remedy those. So those are some key things to do. But that was my last slide, and I will end it there on special needs trust. And thank you very much, and we'll open it up for any questions.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Antonio. That was a lot of great information, actually. So we have people on YouTube and Facebook live through the Mohsen pages. And so one of the first question that came in from Ahmad was about, let's say, there's an inheritance from the parents. Will a third party special needs trust need to be set up from that, right? So the exact question is, for inheritance from parents, will also need to be saved in third party special needs trust?
Yes. So let me clarify that too. Good question. So let's say, for instance, you would probably have two special needs trusts for an individual. You'll have a self-settled trust, which the person with the disability can invest in or put his money into. And then you would also have a third party special needs trust for family members. And you don't want to commingle those because of that Medicaid payback provision. That self-settled funds you want to keep separate. The inheritance from the parents, even if they're alive now and they're gifting, or if they pass away, that third party special needs trust would be set up to take that money from those third party individuals. And that can include myself, grandparents, and other individuals who want to invest in that person with a disability.
Shazia asked us, after opening the special needs trust, the beneficiary can't keep more than $2,000 in their account. So they want
Yeah.
clarification.
Yes. So let me clarify this. So if a person with a disability has more than $2,000 in their account, when the agency SSI normally sends you a record of documentation, and it'll ask whoever that rep payee is, that's the term of the person who handles the funding for that individual. The rep payee will notate this and say, hey, they have $3,000 here. And then Social Security will say, okay, well, we need to either take back that thousand and we're going to lower your monthly payments. So you're setting up the special needs trust. So that way, any funds that are over $2,000, you can transfer over into that self-settled special needs trust for that individual. That way, when SSI comes looking, you can show them, hey, we have a special needs trust account. Those funds and resources are not countable toward that 2000, but they're still able to use those and use those for supplementing things that they need down the line. So if you want them to go to summer camp, maybe there's some program that you wanted them to be involved in. And these can be very expensive. Most of the time, the camp for 2 weeks is maybe $4,000 or $5,000. So having those funds available for them to go to this or respite care and take care of that would be a huge boom. And you don't want to just have to spend those down frivolously on stuff to keep the governmental benefits going. So I hope that answers your question.
So that allows a cushion of sorts
Yes.
instead of having to, like you said, instead of spending it frivolously just because you have to spend it down, you can put it into this trust, build up the assets, have a little bit of a cushion. It definitely makes it a little bit easier. Shazia also asked, can we set up trust with you if we don't live in Texas or Maryland? It's a really good question, actually.
Yeah, really good question. So what I can do is connect with an attorney, because maybe another attorney in whatever state you're in, I can meet with them and say, hey, let's team up. I'll do the special needs provision. They'll do another portion of the trust, and we can team up to take care of you and get your needs met. Thank you for the question.
Okay, what other questions might the audience have today? I think we have, we do. We have Antonio's information here. So if you don't want to ask your question publicly here, you can, of course, email him or give him a call. It is Saturday, so he might respond in days. But certainly, there's an opportunity to engage with him. Is there a suggested age to open the special needs trust? Fulton asked.
No, not really. It would be more when you're getting governmental benefits is more of the pressing question, because once you start getting public assistance or governmental benefits, that's when you want to have the trust set up. Now, you may want to set up a revocable trust for yourself if you have minors, because then that way, if you're gifting to them, you have a trust set up based on your desires and wishes on how you want to give your assets to them. So maybe a revocable trust for yourself. But if your kids are already disabled, then yes, setting up a special needs trust once they start getting governmental benefits is something that you would want to do, because you really wouldn't need it beforehand to hoard the money, because if they got gifts or whatever, you can just put it in an Amana, minors trust account for them, and they would be fine with that. Thank you for the question.
Okay, so we don't have any other questions, but while we wait, if there is another one or two questions, what you could do as the audience is, if you know other people that might need to hear this presentation, it's going to live on YouTube and Facebook. So have, maybe get the link for them and send it to them if you think that they would need this. There's a question here. If we choose a service like yours, a sibling will need not to manage the account, correct? Can that sibling still have some ability to oversee the account?
Yes, and I'll let Oways kind of jump in on this. Most of the time, with a special needs trust or maybe a minors trust account, we can add a professional trustee like Sir Turner and Oways, and then the brother and sister can also be a co-trustee, so they can get an accounting and oversee what's going on with the account. So that's a really good question, because you sometimes still want a family member still involved, and the beneficiary can always come. Maybe they have a disability, but maybe they're still, have capacity to review some of the accounting on their own always, if you want to jump in on that as well.
Yeah, and it gives the family member some ability to be able to see what's going on as well. And if they need to do more for the child, if they don't have enough, they'll be able to see what the trust is doing and kind of be the overseer as well. There's a couple of, I think, clarifying questions here. One is, can you please send us the name of the Dallas, Texas for Special Needs Trust? That would be you. You can handle these trusts in Texas.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. You can reach out to me if you have any questions on special needs trust and we can do a consultation. I'm happy to jump on calls with individuals to help answer these questions.
And Furkan wants to clarify, so does this need to be set up and funded before they turn 18 years of age?
If you think that the child, when they turn 18, so say for instance, I had two siblings. When my mom passed away, my brother was 25, or my sister was 17. Normally, when a person with a disability, they kind of aged them out to 21 as opposed to 18. So at 21, normally that's when they become quote unquote majority for a person with a disability. And at that age, I could put her into a residential group home. That way she could be around individuals with disabilities, but we had already started to set up a special needs trust fund for her. Yes. So again, it's more about the governmental funds. If you're getting governmental funds or you see in the future that you're going to get some governmental assistance, then I would set it up right away. And if you have more questions, if you want me to look and say, hey, this is what my situation is, we can do a little bit more deeper dive to answer that for you.
So if somebody does contact you afterwards, Antonio, and they set up a quick conversation just to determine whether they need to set up a trust or if they're within the parameters or whatnot, there's probably no charge for that part of it, correct?
Yeah, there's no charge for that. That's a free consultation. I actually had a client come to me maybe about a week ago, and I told her, you don't need a special needs trust. Your son works. He has capacity, which means he could sign his own documents. There weren't any governmental funds involved, so why charge her, $4,000 and $5,000 when she can just get charged something different and do a revocable living trust for herself, where she could set aside assets for that child, but have a different trustee manage it for that individual. Because maybe there's some spendthrift, maybe they're creditors, maybe that individual isn't so good with money. So you want to have a professional trustee go and say, okay, you have a number of assets here. Let's manage this for you. So mom and dad won't be, pulling their hair out beyond the grave because you spent this money, unwisely. And that happens. So again, reach out to me. I think for your child, setting it up. If you think they're getting governmental funds, again, let's talk about setting up a special needs trust for he or she.
Yeah, and I think the way that you can go, because attorneys don't practice in every state, but they do work with other attorneys, as Antonio mentioned. So since you have, brother Antonio's information here, and we just built somewhat of a relationship, you could just reach out to him and he can tell you whether to go to another attorney that he knows in your state or whether he can work with someone. And that's going to be the easiest way rather than trying to find your own attorney. So you have that opportunity because you met Antonio here today. There's a question here, Antonio, about what are the red flags to look for to suspect mismanagement of the trust funds from a professional trustee or a family member. I mean, I'll give a couple, and then you can maybe with this. I think you need to, as you're looking in as the family member, look in for, this is not mismanagement, but just not like taking the funds or anything like that, but the fact that they're not responsive, right? So if a trust company or a family member is not responsive, or you got to check where the money is going. So if the money is not going for the health and maintenance of this person, education or whatever it's set up for, you have to figure out where that money is going. And this is very easy to figure out. So I think especially with a professional trust company, you can easily see that. With family members, do you have any other comments on that, Antonio?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that to piggyback off what you said, if whomever the trustee is not communicating well, Another thing is commingling funds, which most of the time a professional trustee won't commingle funds. They have a duty where a family member will. They'll say, hey, I set up a bank account, and then they're using the bank account sometimes for things that they shouldn't. And then if that family member, can't respond or give some reason. And again, the flip side too is if they're giving away the money too freely, where you think, hey, there were some restrictions in place. Said individual went out and bought a new car. What do they need a new car for? They just had a reasonably decent car. So those are some red flags that you would be looking for and suspect mismanagement.
Well, thank you for all the questions so far. If there are other questions, we can take them here. If not, we do have the information for Antonio here. And again, like I said, if you believe that there's other people in your family or community that need to hear this, please share the link, or you can invite Antonio or Antonio and myself to come out and give a presentation as well. Does Antonio also offer a guardianship? And we have two special needs. So do we need two trusts? So are there guardianship and, I think you get that.
Yeah, very good question. So guardianship is something separate. Guardianship is very technical too, because when you assume guardianship, you're basically becoming that that person's parent. You're somewhat saying you're going to be personally and financially responsible for that person, as opposed to a conservatorship. A conservatorship means, hey, I'm going to step in and help manage this person's finances, not take care of their financial well-being altogether. So I would speak to you about that first. Now, in special needs, yes, if both individuals have disabilities, I would set up two third-party special needs trust for them, because you don't want to commingle those funds. You want to keep them separate. And if they have self-settled special needs trust, you would set that up. So basically you would have 4 trusts, which is a lot to manage. And that's why you have professional trustee who would step in and say, hey, we can help manage these for you, keep the accounting and the records, because sometimes some of these trusts are going to have to do a tax return. You're going to have to do a 1041 for some of these trusts and submit that to the IRS. And that's where people get a little, where it's like, I didn't know that, or, I don't know how to do that. And now you're having to spend, probably more money in managing some of those things as if you didn't leave it to a professional trustee. But my recommendation would be to do 2 separate special needs trusts for the 2 individuals. And then we can have a guardian, a conversation about guardianship. And that's a different process altogether.
Thank you for that, Antonio. If you have your final questions, ask them now. We have 5 minutes left. If no other questions, then we will bid you a fond farewell after this. So get all of your questions in now, and so we can answer them. And let's see. All right. Thank you for the comments there. Mostly, I would say about Antonio. And all right, I think we don't have any other questions. I mean, the presentation was phenomenal. It's probably worth going back and looking at some of that, because we went through it relatively quickly. You can go back on Facebook or YouTube and look at the individual pieces there, right? The individual slides. So thank you very much again, Antonio. Thank you to Mohsin for having this, and for realizing that this is obviously a big need in the community as well. And if we can do these in the future, we would certainly like to do that. Any final comments from Antonio or Mohsin?
Thank you all very much for this opportunity. Hopefully I provided some clarity for folks, and I look forward to answering any questions that individuals have. Thank you.
Just wanted to say thank you so much to our 2 speakers, both Brother Oways and Antonio from Saturna and AMG Council. We just want to say thank you so much for your time today and for answering our family's questions. Again, as been mentioned previously, all the contact information for Antonio is on the screen above, and this live is saved. So do share with your friends and family who could benefit from this information, and reach out with any questions. All right. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.